Hello, and welcome to the Sauna Trail Book Club. This is Risto with the Sauna Trail, and I may be joined by some guests tonight. We've invited people to read our book, read along with us. I have a copy of it here. But before we get started with that, I want to kind of share a little bit of background for this book. We'll be breaking the book into 3 sections. So the book club will start tonight and then go each week on Tuesday and through November. So 4 weeks in total. Let me give you some of the background of this book. The Sauna Is by Bernhard Hillila was published in 1979. And sauna had, starting in the 50s and especially into the 60s, been experiencing tons of popularity in North America. So you can see here, this is a chart that shows when the term Finnish sauna was used in books in print. It really started to shoot up into the 50s and then into the 60s and 70s. The interest was kind of at the level that we're at today. They started adding saunas to gyms like the YMCA, hotels, boardrooms, and then the Amazon of that day, Sears, they would even sell sauna related things. So it was super popular. And when sauna was first introduced to the North American market, the articles kind of look like this here. So you can see that it has like a family and it's a separate structure and wood burning and community based, and it even had like Vitas. So it was like very much a Finnish cultural thing. But as time went along, it became more like this, which we've talked about in past episodes. They just started labeling anything that got you hot as a sauna or sauna. And so then a gentleman saw this happening, and his name is Bernhard Hillila, and he was uniquely situated to write a book about sauna to kind of correct some of the record. He was uniquely situated because he was Finnish American. He was an academic and an educator, so he knew several languages and he could do research. And he was a poet, so he could communicate well. And he was kind of a fun dude. He was also a slackliner way back in the day. So he, in the 70s, he decided to start researching, and he even took a trip to Finland, which he talks about in the first chapter. So I have a video where I'm reading through the first chapter of the book. And he had published this book through a small publisher in New York Mills, Minnesota. They're called Parta Printers. And then later it was republished a few times. Let's see, there's the first edition, which I highly recommend the first 2 editions. The illustrations were done by his wife. So there was a 79 and then a reprinting in 88. And then the final reprinting that I know of was in 2003. And the last 2 were published by a different publisher. And there's even a Kindle version. So if you want to catch up and join us, you can always get a hold of a digital copy real quick. And the chapters are really short and easy. Let me actually pull up the book. We'll take a look at it. This is the 1988 version. So tonight we'll be going through the first 3 chapters of the book. You can see right here, part of my heritage, a bath that's different, and a bathhouse with a history. So we'll be looking through those. So let's go ahead and just jump into the first part, a part of my heritage. This chapter kind of gives the reason for why he decided to write the book. He gives the purpose of the book and then also the background, kind of how he went about writing it. The purpose of the book that I got out of this chapter was he wanted to introduce people to sauna who weren't aware of the practice. Now, by this time in the late 70s, it was pretty much a household name in the United States. Probably most people knew about it, but in case they didn't, he wanted to be the first to give them a clear picture of what it was. But then also he wanted to correct the record. So as we go through this book, there's going to be a lot of him correcting the record. And then The other part of this chapter is discussing how he's going to do this. He's going to define what authentic sauna means to him and describe what that bathing experience is. And I'll be especially interested to see, it's been a while since I've read the book, to see how in depth he gets with the description. Because a lot of books, even though there's many books written about sauna, there's very few that actually kind of walk you through in detail what a Finnish American or Finnish sauna practice, what that's like. And then after he describes what that bathing experience is like, he's going to talk about the historical, physiological, psychological, and even moral issues. So it might get a little spicy. And then at the end of the book, provide some information about how to construct a sauna. So that's where most of the discussion and debate is these days online, is people arguing about whether you're constructing it right or not. But that's at the very end of his book. And then it's pretty much what I said. He wanted to correct misinformation, help people unlearn some of the things they had learned. And I've run into that a lot with sauna is you say the word sauna and most people kind of have an idea in their head of what that is, but it's going to be very different. Most Americans, their idea is very different than like what a Finnish American may have in mind. There's some commonalities. They're probably both thinking of a wooden room somewhere and it's going to be a hot room. And then maybe steam, but that's about where things start to deviate. And then chapter 2, the sauna is a bath that is different. So if you remember, if you go back to I'm going to go back to the table of contents. Just looking at the table of contents gives you kind of an idea of what he thinks about the sauna. So like heritage is the first chapter. Then bathhouse, history, Finns, bath. Then some of the others you might see in other books, but several of those he's kind of starting out very like bath and cultural heritage centric. Okay, so a bath that's different. This chapter is kind of explaining what sauna is at a high level. He starts with the word, with the pronunciation. Anytime you're learning something new about a different culture, or you try a new dish at a restaurant that has serves food from another country, one of the first things is you're asking what's the name, and you're trying to pronounce it correctly. So he gives the correct pronunciation there. And he describes sauna, he defines it at a high level as both a place and a practice. And the practice is the bathing part or a bath. The bath part is twofold. There's perspiring. That's kind of like cleansing from the inside. You're kind of sweating out all the gunk that you maybe had in you. And then washing. So then that's washing that off at the end. So there's kind of that two part. It's like a sweat bath and then just kind of a standard bath with like a bar of soap or a shower. And he kind of lays out the definition of sauna, and I kind of took away as like this would be a good basic definition of sauna, would be a Finnish bath that is accomplished through perspiring and washing. Obviously you have to unpack a lot of that. It's also leaving out a lot of the practice. But the question is like, what is the washing part like? And then how do you get to be perspiring? That's kind of the basics of what he has there. And then there's also a lot that's kind of bound up in the finish part of that. And then he mentions the hot air range of 160 Fahrenheit to 230. Although I don't think he loves sauna at those much higher temps. But he makes a good comparison. Like a lot of people think 212, your blood starts to boil. Isn't this going to be unsafe? But he does bring up a good picture of like when you have an oven set to 450 and then you reach inside the oven, it's not like your arm burns off right away. You're able to, the hot air is not too bad. You don't want to touch the metal, obviously, but you can have your arm in there for a little while. And then, of course, he mentions humidity, that the humidity is raised by splashing water on the rocks. But he makes special note to say that the humidity is not really raised that much. He objects to the use of the term steam bath because the relative humidity stays low. He prefers the term vapor bath. And that actually was a term, if you go look through old newspaper articles and documents, vapor bath is a term that you can find. And then he makes this distinction that the important part of sauna is the ability to regulate that humidity by splashing water on the rocks. So it's kind of he's getting into some more the more technical by saying like the air temperature is pretty high and the relative humidity is pretty low, but you can raise it just a little bit by splashing water on the rocks. And then he digs into a little bit and comparing it and contrasting it with Turkish hammam and Japanese onsen. And then he mentions that it's repeated sweating, washing, and deep cleansing and relaxation. So that's kind of, he's covered it in chapter 2, he's covered it at a high level. And then we get to chapter 3, a bathhouse with a history. So now he's going to start to go into, he told you what he's going to do in the book, chapter 1. He's defined sauna at a high level, chapter 2, which is very good. And then chapter 3, he's going to dig into kind of some of the more general history. And you can see a little bit of his academic side come out in this chapter. He's got a few little interesting nuggets. My high level summary of this chapter was different motivations and expressions of bath or bathing, and then the roots of sauna. He calls it a joyful bath, a bath that has ritual, kind of multifaceted. He uses the term perspiration bath. That's an interesting way to phrase it. Talks about ancient Roman baths, and in this underlined section here, that the Spartans would go between this hot, dry heat and a plunge in the water, which is you're starting to get kind of in the sauna territory, maybe without the steam. He mentions that some early church fathers had quotes about bathing, and the church sometimes would look on it positively, kind of the whole cleanliness next to godliness thing, but then also negatively in some terms, like it was more godly not to bathe a lot. So it's been looked at at different ways throughout history from the religious establishments. But in some societies, it was a part of society, and they had these large public baths. He even mentions that Roman bathhouses had lecture rooms, which I'm not sure you would do in a lecture room, maybe a book club. But that would be fascinating. It would be interesting to go back and visit one of those old baths. And that later in Europe, a lot of these bathhouses developed into a place of sexual activity, which he's going to address some of that in the later chapters. And then he does talk about Russian banya. And I don't know if I agree with Bernard on this one or not, but he says that it's more wet and is more like a steam bath. So I'm always hearing conflicting things on these. Either Banya is hotter or it's less hot or it's more steamy, less steamy. I don't know. I think there's a lot of expressions of Russian Banya and Finnish sauna, and there's quite a bit of overlap. He also mentions hot springs and Native American tents, and that it's a good place to clear your mind and feel better. In fact, he mentions a story about Native Americans, a story where they were talking about going to the sweat lodge after the death of a wife, a spouse, and that it made them feel much better. So, as you can see, the chapters are pretty short. I think this third one was the longest, but it's not too bad. There's the story about the sweat lodge. And so he's covered what he's going to do in the book, uh, kind of just a general overview. Very good chapter on defining sauna. So I'd highly recommend checking out this chapter if you're like, what is sauna? And then the history. And then in the next chapters, he's going to dig more into the actual finished practice. So if you take a look at the contents here, next week's book club, we'll be discussing, whoever wants to join, either I'll be discussing, going through my notes and sharing them with you, or if you guys want to come on, you can read, and if you have any notes you want to share with the rest of us, kind of share your thoughts and ideas, you're welcome to do that. So the next 3 chapters are a gift from the Finns, a bath that is enjoyable, and a means of rejuvenation. So he's going to start getting into some of the more details and specifics. And you can see, I meant to say this earlier, just how like small this book is. It's a very easy read. It's one of the smallest sauna books I have, but I also think it's one of the most important because of how much went into it. Anyone knows that if you try and create like a short definition that's comprehensive, that's a difficult thing to do. So here's the breakdown of the 4 weeks of the book club and the next 3 weeks there. You can see on November 11th, I'll cover those three things, and maybe I'll have Julie join me or one of the kids. And then November 18th, spot for relaxation, a setting for propriety. I mentioned he's going to talk about the sexualization of the bathhouse, an aid for grooming. And then on November 25th, room for heating, a project for do-it-yourselfers, and a variety of designs. So that's going to be kind of construction focused, which isn't the main focus of the book, but it'll still be interesting to see what's said there. So I think that's the end of my notes and my presentation. I recommend if you get a copy that you get one of the 79 or 88 if you can track down a used copy of those. The reason I say that is because the artwork is more of that original artwork and it's less kind of comedically focused. He did write another book that was very comedic. I think it's called Fin Fun. And they've kind of, the publisher decided to take that theme and move it over to the sauna book. But the sauna book's not very funny, even though he does, you do pick up he has a good sense of humor, but it's actually a rather serious book. So that's why I like those first two versions better. And then if you want to get anyone just a great starter book on sauna, I highly recommend this book. It's just a good introduction if someone wants to understand it. Thanks for joining me on the stream tonight, and I hope you get a chance to read the book, and I hope we get a chance to speak with some of you next week. Welcome to week 2 of the Sauna Trail Book Club, where we're going through, as you can see on the screen, Bernhard Hillila's The Sauna Is. This week we have A Gift from the Finns, A Bath That's Enjoyable, and A Means of Rejuvenation. So those are the 3 chapters we're going to be talking about tonight. And I'll give you kind of a little bit of a preview of what those are as well. Next week, the next 3 chapters. And then the final week, November 25th, also Tuesday. This one gets into some more of the specifics and building, which it tends to be a pretty popular topic in the sauna world. So it'll be interesting to see what Bernhard has to say about that. So, chapter 4, A Gift from the Finns. I won't go into detail yet with it, but just kind of my high level summary of that chapter is that sauna is, it talks about the unique Finnishness of sauna and that it's not just a generic thing, that there is a Finnish expression of this type of bathing, and how marketing and commercialization tend to water that down or ruin that unique Finnish expression. Or another way to say that would be like how it's mistranslated through marketing. And then chapter 5, A Bath That's Enjoyable, discusses how it's more than just a health treatment. Kind of gets into some of the details on how to sauna. More than just, oh, it's hot or it's steam. He kind of walks you through a step-by-step process. To me, this is one of the most important chapters. Chapter 5, A Bath That's Enjoyable. This is where I would tell people to focus, especially if you're not familiar with Finnish sauna. And then chapter 6, A Means of Rejuvenation. And that one gets into some of the physiological and health stuff. And so I have a few notes from this chapter. It wasn't the most interesting for me. I'm not super interested in what the health benefits are or what's going on physiologically. But perhaps if you guys read it, if you want to leave any comments about that, I would be interested to hear your thoughts. And it'd also be interesting to see how things have, perhaps how understandings have changed in the past 30 years. Let me go ahead and pull up my notes. Let me skip ahead to chapter 4. A Gift from the Finns. So, like I said, this one kind of focuses on the unique finishedness of sauna and discusses issues with marketing and commercialization. If anyone's in the sauna industry or just a rabid sauna enthusiast like I am, this one's kind of a good chapter to understand kind of what's going on in the culture with sauna. So I have underlined here, although not a Finnish invention, it is nevertheless the Finnish development of an ancient European bath culture, and it has acquired a distinctive Finnish character. So anyone who's studied the history very much knows that sauna isn't purely a Finnish invention, but they took a somewhat widespread or regional practice and made it their own, and they really championed it. And he notices that the disconnect from the Finnish part of it, that sauna is often sold as Nordic or Scandinavian. But in some of those neighboring countries, the practice, not all of them, but in some of those neighboring countries, the practice died down quite a bit. So, and he refers to it as the Finnish sauna is a unique combination of the Roman dry heat bath and the Russian wet steam bath. And I'm not as knowledgeable on that Russian steam bath or the banya. There are a few parts where Bernhard talks about that, and I wasn't sure if he got that quite right. I always hear lots of conflicting things about the Russian banya. He does mention that sauna came to the US in different waves. The earliest would be in the 1600s, but then to Alaska in the 1830s. And I don't know much about that history. I don't know if there's any books on Finnish immigration to Alaska in the 1800s, but that was a little bit before we had the most amount of immigrants who came to Michigan and Minnesota and other places in the lower 48 states. But Alaska's also an interesting place because I think there was some influence from Russian banya being so close to Russia. So Alaska might have some echoes of both of those types of practices. And then he says that it's most correctly applied to when you have a dry heat bath that has steam. So those are kind of the two basic elements, at least in the hot room, of this kind of like dry and hot environment. It's mostly dry, but then you have the steam element that kind of raises the feel of the temperature in the room. And I've quoted this several times in different places. My second underline here, it says, with the American penchant for merchandising, there is, however, a danger that in our land, the concept of sauna will be stretched badly out of shape to include sauna belts, sauna facial masks, sauna tubs, sauna cabinets, sauna tents, and steam rooms of all kind. If the product involves heat, the ad man gets a sudden perspiration and says, let's call it a sauna. That's an in term. Such saunas lose something in translation. And that's pretty much what had happened. I think he was noticing that. And then he also mentions that it has many uses. So he does talk about the hot room, which often gets most of the press with sauna. But he mentions here at the end that it was like very useful for farmers. They could use it for cooking, for bathing. Meat could be cured there. Flax was dried. Barley was malted. Skis could be waxed there. Leather worked. Wood shaped for furniture. Children were often born in a sauna. The sick were treated. Athletes conditioned. The post hunting place where you could go. And then also bridal preparation rituals, which a friend of mine actually sent me an article about that recently. She did it with her sister. And it's often part of holidays. I know it's midsummer celebrations. Sauna is a big part of that. And then also Christmas celebrations. And so that kind of summarizes chapter 4. I think there is a tendency not just for people selling saunas, but anyone that wants to help popularize it, even from places of where it's good motives, like you love sauna and you want to share that with other people, that there's kind of this idea that like we can share it more broadly and widely if we don't have too narrow of a perspective on it. I think what ends up happening is that it gets watered down and a lot of those unique finish elements get lost so that it becomes like what I grew up with, which was basically the somewhat hot cedar room in a hotel with not very good ventilation and the idea that like you shouldn't put water on the rocks. And then the difference also, I was thinking about this, the difference between marketing and culture is marketing is trying to communicate something and sell something to an audience. And when you're trying to communicate something, it's good to do it in a brief and concise way. Your advertisement can't be 15 minutes long. And then you also have to make a product of the thing. So you kind of end up boiling things down to what you see as the basics. So there's this pressure to simplify the messaging about the practice or product. Whereas culture is kind of like on the opposite end of things. You think of a birthday party, and if someone told you in their family they do cake and then songs, maybe even they have their own kind of family, special family things around that and a meal. Like the more things you add to those practices, the kind of more robust it is. You think of Thanksgiving or Christmas, there's a lot of elements that could go into that. And so I think that's true also of sauna, where the cultural aspect, if you take time to pay attention to it, actually has a lot going on. But the commercial just tends to simplify and simplify and simplify. And I would say oversimplify. So that's chapter 4. Chapter 5, a bath that's enjoyable. This chapter, he mentions the health aspect, but makes a special point to say that it's more than just a health treatment. And then he goes into detail on how to sauna. So it's kind of those two parts. The first part is you can see in the picture here, is that a bowl of sausages he has, maybe some bread, wine. So I think that picture is supposed to kind of represent that it's not just like a pill that you're taking. And oftentimes, sauna is discussed as a treatment. These days, it's popular to use the term heat therapy, or that it is a health and wellness product. And certainly that is part of sauna, but he doesn't view it primarily through that lens. He sees it as kind of something more enjoyable. He talks about the health thing just briefly, and then he starts going into the details on how to sauna. Different people have different patterns of bathing in a sauna. Some stay briefly, others luxuriate for a long time. Some make a single visit to the heat room, others pop in and out many times. Some take moderate heat, throw no water on the rocks for steam, and never touch a whisk. A whisk being the bundle of branches or the vita. Others seem to be masochistic in the intensity of the baking and self-flagellation. And that's true even in the Finnish world. I've noticed that is that there's definitely different expressions of sauna. Let me give you just a few examples. There could be sauna like on a vacation, like on a summer vacation at a cottage. And then you might have the sauna going heated all day long. If you have a lake nearby and people are going in and out of the lake, or you're just not on a strict time schedule, you might go 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 rounds even. You might really take your time and have a long time between rounds. And then you might have a sauna that's kind of like a get together with friends, or it's on a weekend where you have some more time. And then it might be 2, 3, 4 rounds, and you might have friends over, and it's kind of like a dinner party type of thing. And another aspect might be just more practical as a way of bathing, and that might just be a single round and almost daily. So I've heard of several people who understand the practice really well that most of the time their saunas are 20 to 40 minutes and just one round and washing up, and then they're done. They go off to work or on with their day. But he gives kind of the second one I mentioned, the 3 to 4 round one, he kind of lays out the process. Let me go through the steps with you. The first one would be to undress, just like you would for a shower or bath. He says sauna should be naked. Then you go into the hot room, and he puts that about 15 minutes in the hot room. You'll eventually start sweating, and that this is a time to disconnect from media and stimulus and start relaxing. And then after that, you could rinse or shower, rinse that sweat off. And then you go to cool and rest for, and he puts this at approximately 10 minutes. But obviously, it matters like what the weather is, what the environment is, but a chance to just kind of let your body normalize again. And then you go back to the hot room. And he says you could take steam in this round, and you could do that in the first round as well. But you might start using the branches lightly, and he says birch branches, to kind of just lightly beat yourself or the other person you're with. Beating might be kind of misnomer a little bit. It's more like kind of just a light massage. And then he discusses this, it moves the air around. So you get the scent from the leaves, you kind of move the air around and the steam in the air, and then you also get that light massage. And then you'd rinse and shower after that and go back to resting again outside the hot room. And then the third round, when you go back in, he calls this like the deep roasting, or the final round, if it is your final round. So to really take in the heat and steam. And then this is where at the end of this round, if you're going to be done, you would soap down and wash. So if there's a shower in the hot room, you could use that. Or if you had a number of buckets, which is a pretty traditional thing, some of that water's been heating up and you can mix it. Or if you have a hot water heater, you can mix the warm and hot with the cold and get the temperature of water that you would like for washing. And then you just soap down. That's why you need a drain in your hot room, because then you could soap and then rinse everything off. So that's your final kind of rinse, shower, and then you would air dry. Or he mentioned something kind of drying off with a coarse towel, and I haven't done that. I haven't heard a lot about that. So if anyone knows about that, you could put that in the comments. I don't know if he's talking about an exfoliation or what he's talking about with that coarse towel. And then he doesn't mention this so much here, but this is probably, if you're getting together with community or friends, you might take turns doing this, and maybe it's only one or two rounds if you have a bunch of separate groups going. But then at the end, you might serve food, and you might hang out and like hang out in the dining room and talk. This can be part of the community time. Let's see, what else was interesting in this? He mentions a little bit of the climate details, like an 80-degree differential between your head and foot. And that so sometimes your feet are a little cooler because the hot air is rising. So he mentions you can put them up on the wall or up on sometimes they'll have a rod that you could put your feet up on to try and get even heat, or you can lay down on the bench. And then he discusses how to make those bundle of branches, or the vita, what time of year is good, and then how to store them. So there's some good information about that. I did find it interesting that everyone has their own unique sauna opinions. He was opposed to cooking in the hot room, like sausage on the rocks, or I don't know what else you could do, eggs or potatoes, but he thought that should be done outside the hot room. So that brings us to chapter 6. Let me see if there's any quotes here. He mentions the workout for both the hot and cold sensing parts of you. He says the acme, or the height of sauna experience, is achieved when the shower is replaced by a dip in a lake, and when one can sit outside in the altogether dried by unpolluted breezes. And that is true. Relaxing outside in nature, in the fresh air, after dipping in the lake or a river, that is the best. Yeah, here's where he mentions the brisk rub with the coarse towel. I think it is good to air dry afterward. The heat room should be properly ventilated. That is very true. Okay. Then a means of rejuvenation. And like I said, I didn't go into tons of detail in this chapter. If you're interested in health and physiology, you'd want to get into this chapter. So he says the wet skin results not from condensation of steam, right here, as in Turkish bath, but rather from perspiration. And I think there is some condensation that's happening. And then he says, wetting the skin before entering the hot room also helps. Again, I'm not sure about the physics on that one, but I do think it is a good idea to go and wet and spray your walls. If it's too dry, it's kind of hard to breathe. I don't think it's as nice. He mentions an article written by the travel writer for Chicago Tribune. If anyone is interested in that article, just reach out to me. So he referenced it, and I thought, oh, I should track that down. See, it's from 1975. It's always so he did an article on Finnish sauna and then bathing in Finland and bathing in Japan, which those have been compared before. In fact, I think there's a book that has both Japanese bathing and Finnish bathing. Here we go. This book right here. And then there's an architect in New York who built a bathing tower that had both the Finnish and the Japanese. So I'm not sure if the text comes through, but you could always screenshot these and read the article. Okay, back to chapter 6. He mentions this Finnish quote right here, and I'm not going to try the Finnish, but I don't want to butcher it. He translates it as, it's a madman that bathes until his skin is scorched. So Hillila wasn't a fan of pushing it super hard or going super long in the sauna. I do know probably a few madmen in the Finnish sauna community who do like to push it quite a bit. A lot of steam and high temps. And they would probably own up to that label. So I'd mentioned before that he visited the Finnish Sauna Society. Here he says, since 1937, Sauna Society of Finland has gathered information and encouraged research regarding sauna. It has been established that more than 1,000 works have been published dealing with the various aspects of sauna. So that's quite a bit. And they started, tying it back into chapter 4, they started with a specific goal to represent the cultural aspects of sauna, and they avoided any commercial interests. And so that I think that helped them not to get watered down, to stay focused. And they have a sauna, the Sauna Society has a sauna village in Finland today that's still going strong. I would love to visit there one of these days. So that's the end of chapter 6. Like I said, there's probably a lot in there that you might want to read if you're interested in the physiology part. But that's the end of those 3 chapters for today. And just a preview of next week. This will be an interesting one for sure. A few of these chapters might get, at least one of them might be a little spicy. But it says a spot for relaxation, a setting for propriety, an aid to grooming, and then we have the construction chapters that final week afterwards. So that kind of summarizes those chapters 3, 4, and 5. And like I said, if you want to join us, join along, read along, you're welcome to. Amazon has a Kindle version of this book. Otherwise, you should be able to find a copy out there, physical copies. If you'd like to join the stream next week, you can read the chapters, come with your thoughts and notes. I'd love to hear what you have to say, not just you guys listening to what I have to say. And I'll just add you to the stage and then we'll talk. It's just like a Zoom session or a video conference call. Thanks for joining for tonight. I think we have some northern lights outside that I might check out. I hope you guys have a good evening, a good week. And if you have the opportunity, check out Bernhard Hillila's book. I think you'll like it. Good night.